Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story.
Hello, it's Friday. We got a video today about some history in Wyoming. I'm using this one because I can, and because it's long, and because I don't feel like finishing the road video. I'm still working on it, but it's a little bit late. Plus, it's an old video, so it's for, hopefully you'll enjoy it. I debated putting it up, but I'm decided I'm going to put it up today. But before all that, we've got the emojis. Are you ready? Here we go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. This shout out is for our friends. Let's see who it is today. Hold on. All right, there go the emojis. We've got Tracy, we've got Tay Weezing, we've got Parks, we got Cruz, we got Fox Clan, we got Ed, Sunrise, Ford, Lakeshore, Skipping, Yaja, Barry, Rushmore, Jason, Eastad, Bell, Nature, Day One, Cokes, Skull, Skipping, Consciousness, Stock, Barry, Kaja, Lynch, Unseen, Pete, Jason, Popcorn, there's Phoenix, there's Matthew, Ford, Jennifer, coming from the back, oh, taking the lead. There's Eddie, there's A-Space. Oh, it's Miss Jennifer. All right, this is Miss Jennifer at home. Once lived in South Dakota, has moved away. She has a fun little channel where she does crafts, decluttering, recipes. I see a lot of recipes. She also does decor. So if you're into organization, decluttering, recipes, check her out. She's got a great channel, very supportive. Like, share, comment. Almost at 4K. Have a good day.
And we are very excited to have this age group interested in presenting their family history. So we have Sarah Jo, Cora, and Maggie Goddard coming to tell us about their family's history on the ranch. And then Grandpa Dan is going to finish up with just a few stories.
Hi everybody, I am Sarah Jo Goddard. I am David and Heather's oldest, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Goddard Ranch history. How an English world traveler became a founding father of Niobrara County and 5 generations of ranchers, or the story of my great-great-great-grandfather. Daniel Everett D.E. Goddard Sr., my great-great-great-granddad. D.E. Goddard was born and raised in Wallington, Surrey, England. Born to his father, D.E., and mother, Elizabeth, on June 28. In 1860, the oldest of 8, he did well in school, attending through university level following his school days. D.E. traveled to Fiji Island and worked in a custom house for 2.5 years before making the decision to immigrate to the U.S. In 1878, 4.5 years before making the decision to immigrate to the U.S. In 8 years, he lived and worked in Osborne County, Kansas. There, he met and married Matilda Spain. In 1886, him and Matilda and the 3 children, including the oldest, D.E. Jr., and 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Edith, moved to the small hamlet of Lusk, Wyoming in Niobrara County. At the time, Lusk was a small multi-family town of only 35 people, but D.E. saw its potential and knew that he could help to transform this burgeoning town on the edge of the prairie. During his time in Kansas, D.E. had become an attorney, and after moving to Wyoming, he continued to work as a barrister and was also a postmaster of Lusk, a position he had held for the next 19 years. D.E. and Matilda built their family as the town of Lusk rose up. He was known for his vast ranch holdings and his civic involvement. D.E. served as a town clerk and was appointed as a U.S. Court Commissioner in 1905, serving as a judge. He and Matilda built a showcase home on the corner of 3rd and May, where today's Yesway sits. It was a large structure with impressive grounds. D.E. was a member of the Catholic Church, but that was his wife's religion. He never quite felt at home in the church since he had come from a staunch Church of England background. This led D.E. to help found, build, and pastor the St. George Episcopal Church. D.E. was also a founding and active member of the Lions, Oddfellows, and Knights of Columbus. After 24 years of marriage, he lost Matilda in 1905. In 1910, he married Florence Webster and had 2 more children, Robert and Florence W. Florence was a match for her husband in both intelligence and ambition. While D.E. is credited for being a major builder of Niobrara County, Florence was fundamental in the improvement of the cultural and educational offerings in Lusk. She was extremely active in the Women's Club and was credited with being instrumental in bringing up the Carnegie Library to the community. D.E. Sr. was considered so instrumental in the growth and progress of the community that upon his death, October 2nd, 1934, a resolution of condolences was proclaimed by the town government. It was estimated that, quote, his greatest work towards building for the future and local expansion came in assisting newcomers filing for homesteads. This is estimated that more than 80% of the land filed proved up was transacted before him. One of those homesteads was the ranch filed on, proved up, and operated by his son, D.E. Goddard Jr., the oldest of his children born in Kansas. Jr. was only 3 when Sr. moved their family to Kansas, from Kansas to Wyoming. While Sr.'s cattle days may have been behind him, Jr.'s were just beginning. In 1886, Lusk was still a tiny frontier town, but by the time D.E. Jr. was 21, he knew ranching would be his life. In 1907, he filed on a homestead, and in 1909, he married Blanche Green, a school teacher from Houston, Texas, who was teaching at the Bonsall School south of Dan's homestead. After returning from their honeymoon, Dan and Blanche went about building a new home and family. First, a new house. Dan had been living in a log cabin tucked into a hillside. Following his marriage, Dan built his bride a new house on the one which still stands and is as a family home today. They also started a family. John was born in 1911. Tragedy struck the young couple following the birth of their second son, Bert. In 1912, Bert was only a little over a week old when Blanche unexpectedly hemorrhaged at home while her husband was gone to town to get supplies. The entire community mourned with Dan and his 2 small children. Dan continued to work and live on a ranch with support from his family and friends. He proved up his claim in 1912 and expanded the ranch to include the Bonsall homestead, where he had met Blanche. This homestead house still stands on the current-day Goddard Ranch. Mary Effie Sheridan entered their lives in 1919, bringing a stepbrother, Alan, Dan Sr. by 14 years, along with 2 sisters. They had moved to Niobrara County in 1912 with his father, Joe, who subsequently tragically passed away. The Sheridan family brought their own homestead to the family collaboration. The Sheridan homestead north of the home base, which is still referred to as the homestead pasture, and Alan and Blanche's own filings west of the main house. A stove can still be found where Alan originally homesteaded. Red Durham cattle were the breed of choice for D.E. Jr., and these were a primary source of income for the ranch. However, like most homesteaders, they also had chickens, horses, and raised their own feed crops. In 1935, just 1 year after his sister and brother Robert died, D.E. Jr. died suddenly while working in Grand Junction, Colorado. Reports were that he succumbed to a sudden heart attack while shooting sheep at a holding in Fruita, Colorado. D.E. Jr.'s death left his son, only 24 at the time, as an existing male heir of the Goddard name. But he wasn't alone. Alan and Blanche continued to ranch with John. With his father's death in 1935, John took on the bulk of the cattle ranching on the Goddard Ranch. His brother Bert had died from internal injuries after a freak accident when he was playing football and accidentally kicked a sagebrush stump instead of the football in 1928. Although older than John, Alan's passing Alan's passion was horses and John's was beef cattle, namely introducing Herefords to the herd. War came calling, and while Alan had served in World War I, John was called into action for World War II, leaving the ranch in Alan's hands. John served in World War II from March of 1942 to October of 1945, serving as mechanic in the supply ran for Iran for almost 4 years.
Thank you.
Upon his return to Niobrara County, John did what most vets did to forget the war, and return to the life he loved. In 1949, on December 23rd, he married the girl next door, Evelyn Heth, whose family also ranched in the Hat Creek area. John and Evelyn continued the tradition of community involvement in civic service. John was a community commissioner for 16 years. He was a member of St. George's Episcopal Church, Farm Bureau, American Legion, VFW, and the Elks Lodge. Evelyn worked at the Hat Creek Postal Office and was an active member of the Hat Creek Community Club. Her fudge chocolate cakes were practically county-wide famous and continue to be a family favorite when baking by the current monarch Terry. John and Evelyn worked hard and raised their 2 children, Daniel and A, born 1952, and Maxine L, born May 4th, 1953. Alan continued to live and work on the ranch alongside John and Evelyn. Although he never married Alan didn't doubted on Dan and Maxine, never passing up the opportunity to spoil his favorite grandniece and nephew. With Mary's passing in 1946, half of the ranch was left for Alan and half to John. And while they didn't always see eye to eye, they made the most management decisions together. The ranch continued to move ahead in agriculture. The first tractor was brought on the black market and was an OF-12. Later, Alan and John purchased an MD and a H tractor. Draft horses, Alan's love, were on their way out. Alan had spent 30 years breeding draft breeds, thoroughbred studs, and working to make his lines leggy and stretched out. An avid elk hunter, Alan wanted horses so that he could go all day and could tail. John and Evelyn also raised chickens. They had an extensive garden, including a large potato patch out west. The whole family and some extended family were expected to help with the potato picking. Time marches on. When Dan was 5 years old and the family said goodbye to the last of the horse teams, when they sent Jack and Jenny, a team of mules, to auction in Lusk. Eventually, Maxie moved out when she married Tom Mitchell, and they started a family in Torrington. Dan, however, stayed on after graduation in 1970 from Lusk High School. He went to work for the county. He was laid off by the county in the spring of 1971. Dan decided to attend Casper College to take some mechanist classes. At the height of the Vietnam conflict, Dan knew odds were pretty good he would get called up and the draft. But when he met Terry Etherton of Upton in the spring of 1972, that didn't stop them from getting plans for their future. Dan and Terry married September 30th, 1972. Dan had received his draft notice. He was 55 and was the last round from Niobrara County. He was to report to Fort Dix in New Jersey on October 24th. Dan and Terry would spend the first 7 months of their marriage navigating Dan's service orders, eventually ending up in Aberdeen, providing grounds in Aberdeen, Maryland. They lived there from January until the war ended and Dan was released in May of 1973. Dan and Terry, in Dan's words, booked it back to Wyoming as fast as transportation could carry them. There they settled into a family house in Lusk. The house had been lived in by Effie, Alan's mother, and needed a lot of cleaning and improvement. Alan had a house remodeled for them while Terry got to work cleaning. The Roper stove had been installed shortly before Effie's death. It was slated to be hauled off when Terry got to work on it to clean up before sale. She realized the stove had hardly been used and was with a little elbow grease, and it was good as new. So the stove moved back into the house where it has been used by 2 more generations. After the returning home, Dan worked at Vollmer's machine shop for 5 years while Terry worked at Ben Franklin's. Their daughter Carrie was born as a birthday present for Dan on May 19th. 1979. The son, David, joined the family on December 11, 1982. After working at Vollmer's, Dan went to work for the Niobrara County Roads Department, where he stayed on for 8 years. Terry ran an in-home daycare at the house in town during this time at the county. Dan continued to work at the family ranch with his father John, taking a leave of absence every spring during calving season. In 1986, John told Dan that he could no longer do the work by himself, and Dan never returned to the county. He stayed at the ranch most of the time while Terry stayed in town with the kids. In total, they lived 13 years in town. Alan died on January of 1987, and John followed shortly after, in November. That year, Dan relocated the ranch, but his family would not allow him until 1989. In 89, Evelyn moved into town, and the next generation fully moved into the family home. David was just turning 5, and Carrie was in the 4th grade. Terry worked in the school district as a paraeducator. As always, the Goddards stayed active in the community. Terry helped start the Homemakers Christmas Bazaar, and the kids were both active in 4-H and in school activities. The family was also heavily involved in the Legend of Rawhide production. Now known for their Herefords in the late 1960s, Dan suggested adding Angus to the line. The birth weights were getting so heavy from the Hereford bulls that they had an extremely high C-section rate. They brought in Black Angus bulls for the heifers. John often stated, "It took me 40 years to clean up the faces on those cattle, and my son ruined it all in 1 year." It was usually said with a smile, nice. Since their winning weight increased by 40 pounds in the first year alone after introduction, the English cross bloodline. These are the cattle type that are still run today. F1 English cross with Black Angus and Herefords. As the family settled into the ranch life, Terry contributed with her first love, Suffolk sheep. Known for her purebred Suffolk flock, Terry and the kids showed both breeding and market classes at county and state fair. In the lean years, the sheep helped the ranch stay afloat through low cattle prices and drought years. While they no longer grew lots of crops, they continued to harvest dry land to hay alfalfa. Terry ran the open cab stick swather on the meadow bottoms, sometimes returning to the house so black grass and debris and pollen, all that you could see were her eyes and her mouth. They continued to use horses to move cattle and do most of the ranch work and bouncing around the county in a white Ford pickup. In the 2000s, the ranch bought their first Japanese thoroughbreds, as Dan put it, or a four-wheeler. This next step in the evolution of ranching would make it so that fewer people could do the work in half the time. Though they continued to keep the horses for riding in the rougher pastures, David and Carrie had several ponies and horses that kept them on their toes. The horse stories from their ranch, like many, could fill a book. However, as times passed and more ranch work had to be done on a four-wheeler, and the horses became less prominent in the day-to-day operations. In April of 2003, Evelyn passed away and Terry became the official monarch. David and Carrie were both in college, and a new generation was just around the flip of the calendar. As the ranch moved into the 21st century, David and Carrie were helping out in between college classes and on weekends. Carrie attended the University of Wyoming and then transferred to SCSU to work on her master's degree. David attended Eastern Wyoming College, majoring in business and welding. After 2 years, David had enough of city life and school, and they moved back home to the family ranch.
He settled in working full-time at Walt's Lathe Machine Shop working on the ranch. Carrie eventually married Chad Bannon from Harrison, Nebraska, and opened her shop, Bloomers, with business partner Twyla Barnett. The next generation started with the birth of Court to Carrie and Chad in August 2005. Carrie started her catering business, Hickory Creek Catering, and then retired from the school district in 2020.
While they joke that Dan never gets off the ranch, he did make time to serve at the Omni board for a few years, as has Carrie Carrie continues to work in the district as a substitute teacher, and if there is a call for food, you can bet Carrie is busy cooking, donating her time and efforts to any fundraiser that needs it. Carrie is a charter member of Lusk Rocks, an important community business organization. In December 2005, David made plans to visit a friend who was attending the university for a New Year's celebration. He joked to his friend that he planned to come down and sweep his roommate off her feet. David had never met the roommate, he just liked teasing his friend Nat. But little did he know that would be a prediction to come true.
David met his wife Heather on December 31st, 2005. They started seeing each other, making the 2.5-hour drive from Laramie to Lusk at all times of day and night to sneak in dates while continuing to both work full-time. While Heather attended the University of Wyoming, after just a few months of dating, David presented Heather with a pair of muck boots during calving season. Determining she did not own any footwear appropriate for tromping around in frozen mud and snow while checking the cows. It seemed to seal the deal, and by July they were engaged and would marry on his grandparents' anniversary, December 23rd, 2006. Heather moved to Lusk and worked at the Lusk State Bank. The young couple originally moved into a trailer house on the Scott Place, a small lease that the ranch ran the replacement heifers on.
After less than a year they moved in with Dan and Terry, and then relocated to the family house in Lusk. A few more moves, including back into that house. A few kids later, Sarah Jo in 2011, Maggie in 2013, Cora in 2015, and David and Heather followed the tradition of David's family. They broke ground on their house in the fall of 2017, with David determined to do as much of the work himself, just as D.E. had done a century before.
By this time, the trajectory of the fifth generation was following much of the same as those before. Live and work in town until they could carve out their own place on the ranch. David left the machine shop in 2012 and went to work for the state DOT. Following his time there, he opened his own machine shop and worked for Richard Waldoff. Heather and David spent as much time as possible on the ranch working and raising their kids. In 2019, they welcomed Rebecca to the family, and then in 2023, Anna Lee was born. By this time, David was driving trucks for Reed Trucking and working on the ranch. Their homestead house was 7 years in the building and wasn't quite finished, though they had a large garden on the ranch and the girls kept in their sheep 4-H projects out there with Terry's flock. Heather originally worked at Leslie Banks and served on the hospital board. In 2012, she went to work for the hospital administration in 2016. In 2016, she decided to stay at home with the kids full time. The family had stayed active in 4-H and this homeschool community. In June 2023, they moved into the work in progress. It took another 2 years and one more baby, but they eventually fully settled in on the ranch, moving out of the family home in Lusk. Baby Journey came home on July 23rd, 2025, and now they live full-time on the original Goddard Ranch, next door to the Bonsall Homestead House, just down the road from Dan and Terry. So that's how 6 girls became the 6th generation of Niobrara County residents, and it all started with a world-traveling Englishman and his Kansas wife, Bride. Thank you.
I've heard a rumor that Grandpa Danny Goddard is in the crowd, but I haven't spied him yet. I was going to say, are you going to come just tell some Goddard or Hat Creek area stories? Okay. Danny can be just pretty darned entertaining if he chooses to be so.
Chooses to. You okay?
Yeah. Remind me tomorrow to put on some sun stuff,
Good idea.
just in case.
Yeah.
We'll forget about the introduction because the girls already stole all my material. Dudley Field Store used to be across the road north of the old schoolhouse up here. And when they changed the highway, Dud moved it over where it sits now. And I assume the post office made the change shortly thereafter to Mabel and Lou Osmond homestead. Getting back to Dad, when I was 12 years old, I got my first turkey license. Well, the only thing we had to shoot was a 12-gauge shotgun, and sometimes it was a double barrel, and if you pulled one trigger, sometimes the second one would go off at the same time.
Oops.
So anyway, Dad decided, he asked Dud, because he knew Dud had a 410 shotgun. He said, "Can we borrow that 410 from you?" And Dud said, "Yeah." And so then Dud loaned us the shotgun, and we bought a box of shells off of his shelf up there behind the cash register. And on the way home, why, the turkeys run across the front of us and stuff. So I bailed out with my shotgun and my box of shells. And Dad said, "Make sure if you shoot it, to shoot it in the head." And so I did. I got my turkey. When we started dressing it, we found out there was a patch of shot less than the diameter of a dime in the head. And one BB went to the leg. Those shells have been sitting on the shelf for so long that they were glued together. back over here on the ridge someplace, and I don't know where they're at. We was trailing cows down through there years ago with Bob Scott coming from the north end of Goshen County. We'd get the cows over here to the clubhouse, and then we'd split the bunches. Bob's cows would go down Old 85 to his place, and we'd go down the Hat Creek Road to the store and cut across to our place. Well, anyway, we was back on a ridge over here, and I'm wanting to say the Rice Homestead, but I'm not sure that's right. But anyway, Pop Scott rode up to me and he says, "Dan, get off of that guy." I looked at him and I said, "What?" He said, "You need to get off of that guy." I didn't know what he was talking about. He says, "Back your horse up and look down." So I did. And there was a rectangular perimeter of rocks there. He said, "There's a soldier buried there." And where he got his information, I don't know, or the particulars, he never said anything about it. But anyway, I got off the guy and I rode around him and we went on our way. J.P. Jensen had a great big, I don't know whether it was a steam tractor or if it was one of the big fuel oil tractors, but he did all the threshing for everybody around the neighborhood. And he would travel from place to place and they would thresh oats and rye, you know, was the main two crops and everything. And he had several boys that were pretty capable, so I don't know if I think the landowner got the help, but I don't know how much help there was. Ed Cook and Morse Keel used to race chariots. Bert Bryant helped. They'd race in Lusk and Harrison, the Guernsey Old Timers Rodeo, Douglas State Fair, and I'm not sure about this, but I think Cheyenne, because one of the guys they raced with was George and Paul Brugman, and they were from Cheyenne. Ed Cook had a very unique horse brand. It was EC, but to read it, you had to lift the horse's tail up, and it was at the base of the tail. That's where that brand was at. And I'm not sure I would want to bend the one to put that brand on. The Hat Creek Ladies Community, or Ladies Club in the Hat Creek community, they'd have a card party once a month. That's one Saturday a month. And usually up here at the clubhouse or at various people's homes, you know. But anyway, after the card party was over, it was in the wintertime when the men all went out to start the cars to warm them up, or to start the heaters and everything like that. And so somebody always had some libation underneath the seat. So they'd partake of that to take the chill off. We used to have dancing at the clubhouse, a Christmas party, picnic at the Cindy Park, where ice cream and pie was for dessert. There was two guys that really liked ice cream, and they used to see who could eat the most. It was Ed Cook and Uncle Al. So when they dished their ice cream up for them, they filled cream cans full of ice cream, and they handed one to each one of them. Morse Keel had a Mexican saddle that he rode in parades with. And the saddle horn on that thing was probably the size of a small dinner plate. I'd never seen one before. Then at one of the intermissions at County Fair, why everybody would go to the city park, and there used to be a band shell. Morse Keel would get up there and he would recite cowboy poetry for hours. No notes, all from memory, and do it at least a couple hours every time he did. I asked my dad one time, I says, how come we can't put hay up down here like they do up on top? And he said, well, it takes twice as much to win a cow up there as what it does down here. So he said, the good Lord provides for it. He said, when you come down over the hill, he says, you're into the Hat Creek Valley, he says, you're entering God's country. I have a lot of fond memories of my growing up years, and I don't think I'd trade any of them for anything. Being raised in the Hat Creek Valley. Thank you.
Well, if this is God's country, and I do think it is, I'm really glad he didn't get confused in the confusion between Hat Creek and Sage Creek, because someone asked me to explain the reason why there's all this Hat Creek stuff, because the creek right over here is Sage Creek. And when the soldiers very first arrived here, they were supposed to be on Hat Creek, which is over in Nebraska. This is where they landed. Nobody knows if it was intentional or through mistake.
I just got distracted.
But words do matter, because now we still, all these years later, have Hat Creek on Sage Creek. So, Danny and Jeb, do you want to come do Hanson family?
Do it in chronological order.
Okay. Okay. And Donna. And is this what you meant, Jeb? Okay.
Okay, I'm going to start by talking about Frank Hansen, who's Danny and Jeb's grandfather. He was born in Illinois in 1870, the youngest of 12 children. When he was still very young, the family moved to Tuckamah, Nebraska, and settled near Silver Creek. At about 2.5 years old, he nearly drowned when he was following his older siblings across the creek and fell in, only to be saved by one of his sisters. At age 11, Frank's brother-in-law, Jim Oliger, was attending school in the winter, and his other brother, O.J., worked in Wyoming and visited home. Another brother, Red, was heading back to Wyoming, and Frank begged to join him. With a little money, the two traveled by foot and hitched rides until they reached Sidney, Nebraska, where they stayed briefly before continuing west. Frank recalled buying a cowboy hat and 6-shooters, though he had little cowboy experience at first. From Sidney, they traveled toward Fort Laramie, alternating between walking and horseback. Frank struggled with his hat blowing away in the wind and often had to chase it, nearly losing it in the Platte River. Fred frequently rode while Frank walked, forcing the boy to struggle along. Actually, they did ride and tie. Along the way, they stayed at the 4P Ranch, where Frank hoped to begin work. At the 4P, Louis Davis was foreman, and Frank was promised work beginning in May. Until then, he lingered with the cowboys, observing their life. When the work didn't materialize, he hired on at the PF Ranch, digging ditches for a few weeks before quitting due to disputes among the crew. He then drifted back to Nebraska, covering long miles on foot, and by the time he returned, he was exhausted but determined. Frank continued finding seasonal jobs. He worked cultivating corn near Tecumseh, and the following winter experienced a great blizzard of 1888 while staying with Jim Olinger. Later, he followed Red again, this time to Node, Wyoming, where he was introduced to John B. Kendrick. He gave him a first steady cowboy job at $25 a month. After that, his wages were raised to $30 a month, and we think it's because he didn't drink and was very cautious, unlike his descendants. His early cowboy years were full of challenges. Horses often bucked, and he had to prove himself. He worked under various outfits, including the O.W. Ranch, where he was part of large roundups. He also worked for Tom Abbott and later for the LX and UT outfits, moving with cattle across Wyoming, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. Frank recalled broncs and balky horses, giving him plenty of rough rides, but these experiences hardened him into a skilled cowboy. Life on the range was unpredictable. Frank endured harsh winters, including being snowed in while traveling with cattle. On one trip, he lost his way in a snowstorm and narrowly survived the cold, finding shelter in a sheep camp. He described riding through deep snow, nearly freezing, and eventually finding out among strangers. Actually, he suffered damage to his arms and feet and never was able to do quite as much. During the 1890s, Frank's work took him across vast stretches of country. In 1890, he joined the LX outfit as an all-steer outfit during the Indian Scare. He wintered in Buffalo and rode with crews driving cattle north and west. In 1891 and 1892, he worked for the UT outfit and later took part in the Johnson County War era, though he focused mainly on his cattle work. He recalled running herds for miles without fences, often sleeping rough and riding long days. In 1893, his experience had grown, and he was trusted with difficult jobs. He took cattle from the Missouri River to Sandstone Creek, camping along the way and facing storms. He described snow so deep it buried shacks and forced men to improvise to survive. Despite hardships, he pressed on with his work, continuing to hire on with outfits like the OW and LX, and enduring blizzards, isolation, and ever-presence of what a cowboy does, the ever-present danger. In 1894, he worked on Hanging Woman Creek. In 1895, he pushed cattle as far north as the Canadian line. At that time, there were 3 cowboys named Frank with the outfit, so he earned the nickname Big Frank. Frank's story reflects the toughness required of early cowboys: long miles on foot and horseback, brutal winters, dangerous broncs, and unpredictable pay. Through it all, he built his reputation as a reliable working hand. What began as a boy's dream of adventure turned into years of hard labor and survival on the open range, shaping him into the man remembered in this memoir. Frank married Catherine Kate Dorsey in 1905. Frank had already used his homestead rights for a homestead for Tom Bell that he sold back to Tom Bell. So Kate homesteaded at the home place on Young Woodland, where Frank had already built a cabin. And this is in 1905. His great-grandson, Ben Frank, and his family presently live at the original home place. Frank and Kate had 2 children, Dan, born in 1906, and Sadie in 1907. Kate was a wonderful partner. She was a mover and a doer. She was instrumental in helping her family grow their holdings.
I'm going to carry down the next generation here. My father, Dan Burke Hansen, was born February 4th, 1906 in West Wyoming, which at that time was in Converse County. His sister, Sadie, was born in 1907. Interesting enough, they had telephone service at that time. It went as far as the Young Woman Creek at that time. In 1911, Dan's half-sister, Margaret Dorsey, taught him how to read and write. Dan and Sadie's mother, Kate, was a firm believer in education, and she was very instrumental, like Garland just said, in getting rural schools established in the area. Dan started school at the Klaus family homestead, which was 5 miles west of his home. Dan and Sadie attended several different schools in that area. As homesteaders moved in, they just kind of moved those schools around. And it's kind of my observation that the homesteaders worked hard to keep the riding distance for the students to less than 6 miles. He could remember the adults talking about the war over in Europe, and they all agreed that the United States should stay out of the war, and there were just about as many people thought that France ought to win as Germany. And then Woodrow Wilson was re-elected on the promise to keep us out of the war. and it's a promise he didn't keep. I guess the politicians haven't changed much. He attended country schools until 1922 when he finished his last 2 years of high school in Lust. In those days, a lot of the country schools would teach the freshman and sophomore year. And he played on the first Lust football team. When he attended high school, the place he attended high school was where the Elks Lodge is now. And there were approximately 100 students at that time, and now there are only about 80. In 1925, Dan attended Laramie College. While in college, he chopped wood, peeled potatoes at a boarding house for his boarding room. He received his teaching certificate in 6 weeks. He began his teaching career at Van Tassel. Of course, his transportation was with a horse, and he got $90 a month. It was 6 hours ride from Van Tassel back to the home place, so he stayed up there during the week. He rode that same saddle that he bought for $40 with his first paycheck. He rode it until he couldn't ride anymore. That's his saddle right over there. He had it re-rigged at least 3 or 4 times with a lot of patches. Those stirrups are made out of brass, so they would break when the horse fell instead of crushed like a wooden stirrup would. And you see a lot of places that were brazed where it was broken. In 1930, he taught at Carbon Black at Lance Creek. Carbon Black blew up. He was right there writing lessons in the morning for the day's work at school. And all of a sudden, the wall bulged in a little bit, and he heard a huge explosion. And he hurried out the door and looked to see what was going on. And there was a man and his son were just staggering around, and huge timbers, this big, were just raining down all around him, just like in some cartoons you've seen. But they didn't get hurt. But they were looking for a gas leak, and they needed to see a little better, so they lit a match, and they found it. Oops. During that time he's at Carbon Black, he filed for a Democratic ticket for the legislature. Much to his surprise, he was elected. In 1931, the Lance Creek School Board found a substitute for Dan's teaching position, and this tall, gangly 23-year-old was headed for Cheyenne. He lost the next election because he had too many no votes on spending money. About 15 years later, Dan was approached by the Niobrara County delegates to ask if he would make another run for the office. His reply, the Democrat Party had gone way over to the left and left me behind. Needless to say, he did not run again. The one thing he learned about his stay in Cheyenne was power corrupts and absolute power absolutely corrupts. In May of 1943, my father married Margaret Brock. An interesting side note, she could never understand why men like to wear neckties. Her father, J. Elmer Brock, said he knew just the man for her since he met my father at various stop road meetings. After they were married, Dan and Margaret moved to the Haydu place. It's roughly 2 miles north of the home place. And that was acquired shortly before that. To this marriage were born 6 children: John, Kathy, Brock, myself, Julie, and Jed. All but 2 of the children were born in Lust. In 1954, my mother's father, J. Elmer, passed away. Consequently, Dan and Margaret bought out her brother's share of the ranch, and the whole family moved to KC. At that point, Dan continued to run the ranches. Spec Black was the Lust ranch foreman until 1980, and Dan Jr. took over. Through the years, Dan and his children and grandchildren have added to the holdings of both the Lust and KC ranches. Dan Jr.'s sons, Dan and Ben, are currently running the Cross Age Ranch. Jeb also runs a ranch in Niobrara County on part of the original ranch. His daughters are involved with helping him as well as running their Landcamer grandparents' ranch. Dan Sr.'s other 4 children, and some of their children run the ranch at KC. Dan and Margaret had 6 children, 10 grandchildren, and 24 great-grandchildren. Thank you.
I don't have a whole lot to add to that, except I was lucky enough I knew Ed Bryant, and I live over here on the Bryant place. And I'm not going to tell his whole story, but I would recommend that everybody that's interested in this area read his book, Hat Creek and Homesteads. It's really good. And I got to know him, and I was pretty lucky that way, and I asked him what the biggest changes were, and the one that kind of struck me was when he was a kid, he did a lot of trapping for muskrats, but they weren't supposed to trap beavers. And there were beaver dams all over. He said there were hundreds of acres of beaver dams on the creek, especially down by the Mill Ranch and down through there. And I try to imagine what it must have been like. Even some of these draws that came up had beaver dams in them that are dry now. Another thing that changed, there must not have been many cattle guards back then. And I think about my grandmother on my dad's side. We all knew them that are my age, women that were born in the 1800s, and they all wore a dress and an apron, and none of them ever did drive a car. And I don't think my grandmother ever rode a horse, but they had a little two-wheel buggy and a little paint horse named Indian, and that's how she would get here to Hat Creek, with that two-wheel buggy. And a horse Indian would get her here and back pretty good. And the only other thing I have is I got to admit, when I first moved here in about 90, I guess it was, I was invited to a party at we just called it the school. I think Danny called it they call it the clubhouse. And I was invited to do it there, and little wedding and then there, and got to talking, and it was kind of a loosely parliamentary procedure, and the next thing I knew, I got elected president. So I asked, well, what is the name of this that I'm the president of? And it's the Hat Creek Women's Club. And well, what do you do? And I think they knew I don't play cards. And I said, well, we play cards. But maybe that was a kind of a roundabout way of ending the whole deal, because I'm still waiting for orders. And that's been quite a long time ago. And I wasn't going to tell that part, but I spilled the beans earlier, so today. So anyway, that's all I have. So thanks.
Okay, we have two more speakers left. We're waiting for the volleyball ref to get here to do the one Hanson history. But in the meantime, we have Roxy Sharp to come up and talk. And Roxy, I don't know, might be the only person in the crowd that can say that she's actually willingly even spent the night in the Hat Creek State Station because she used to spend the night with her friends here.
Come on, as long as I got a cot, bring up an inflatable mattress, we'll be fine. Probably have to put it like a plastic underneath it to make sure it doesn't get popped by anything on the floor, but still.
Yeah, we'll do it.
We'll just need to tell them that.
Well, I used to get to stay here. We considered it, Lincoln and I decided that it was great. Mom and Dad, our family was split. the big boys were Cody, Leaf, and Tom. They were more responsible than we were. They were better company, evidently, than we were. And Mom and Dad would go places and take them, and they would leave the little kids, which were Lincoln and I, at home. And we had a sheep wagon, and we learned to smoke at an early age. And we could slip out to that sheep wagon when Mom and Dad left, because they had a gal working for them who was supposed to help Mom. And she was Indian, and she didn't speak English. And so we slipped out there to have some cigarettes. And it was pretty cold. So we decided to start a fire. And we couldn't get the fire started. And we were pouring kerosene on it. And we had so much kerosene on it that the matches didn't strike. And in the meantime, George showed up. He was supposed to come down and do chores and then take Lincoln and I back up there. And he opened up the sheep wagon, and we were drinking kerosene. Sad that we were unsuccessful in having a cigarette. And he was pretty shocked. But he and Elsie were really nice to Lincoln and I for some reason. And in his later years, he came down to the ranch one day, rode down the back way. And he used to come down, and he would fly down, and he would give us his a ride on the plane, which is great. And he was sitting there, and I said, I never understood why you put up with us. And you took us for flights, and you and Elsie were so nice. And he said, George didn't chuckle much. He just went, huh. Didn't you ever think it's because we liked you? That never crossed our mind. So, staying with George and Elsie was a treat, because Elsie was a wonderful cook. And she treated us real well. And we got to sleep upstairs, which was interesting because there were squirrels, and they'd stash them. There were a lot of apple trees around here, and they'd stash apples in that chimney, and put it down, but then Elsie would get apples well in and hot. So it was a pretty good treat to get there. And one time, Dad was moving cattle to the Lynn place south of town. And he usually took along a couple of hired men, not because they were help, but so he'd have a fresh air. And he had a hired man that was allergic to work. So his saddle was pretty stinky. And they camped here for the night, and George and Elsie had a boxer, and that dog drug off and buried that saddle. It was a pretty rough saddle. But Deborah talked about the Bryant place, and that always amazed me how Edward's family was raised. It was tough every day for them. And we lived on the Jensen place for a while. And Gladys and Edith Jensen wanted to go to high school, but the family didn't have the money for it. So they took down 2 houses in Lust for money. And then they hauled those houses home. And that's where that house came from, was those 2 houses. You could tell because the upstairs, the windows were one size and the doors were one size. And on the main floor, they were different. And another story I'd like to share was there's a pasture near Frisco on the ranch. It's called the Erdman place. And the Erdman family lived there for a short time. They were married. They had 3 children. And 2 of the kids had passed away. And I have no idea from what. But he was gone. And the youngest child was sick. And he was possibly like cooking pop. Anyway, she had heard of a old wives' tale to mix kerosene and sugar and that would cut that and help that baby. Well, she gave that to the baby, and he went to sleep. She thought she had killed that.
Oops.
And it was up the creek from where the main buildings were on the ranch, probably 3/4 of a mile to a mile. And she ate a can of water and took that baby and walked down, and she died in front of the barn. But that baby, Mrs. Christian, Kelly Christian, lived there at that time. And she took care of the baby because Mr. Erdman, Al Erdman, was on. He was a lot of trading. And when he got back, he decided he had enough. And so he took the boy and moved to him. And I don't believe they ever came back. But anyway, this is your story. Thank you.
Okay, Cheryl, you're
And with her new shift, she's off early, so she's already gonna have to waiting for us. But she's shopping, so I'm not too worried about it. I just wanted an idea.
This is Cheryl Lund. She lives right on up.
Because I know it sounded like they had somebody with real history coming up. So again, not in a hurry, just kind of wanted an idea.
This is a side note. I remember
Maybe.
stopping at Doug's store for he could have great pop or orange pop. So, Christina compiled this, so she was here to read it. But, the following narrative was excerpts from an article that appeared in Cow Country, written by Margaret Junie. The book Our Heritage, Librarians and Neighbors, published by the Niobrara County Historical Society. In the book Hat Creek in Hartland by Edward C. Bryant. This is where we got all of our information. The history of the Mill Ranch begins in Boston.
Sounds like this is coming out of a book. I'm going to buy that book later. So.
Okay, I can barely hear her too.
21-year-old Jacob